Comfort women, Japan's 70-year sex slavery controversy. Explain. In August 1910, and a date that to Americans might seem like ancient history, but in Northeast Asia is remembered as if it were yesterday. The Empire of Japan formally took over what was once had been the sovereign nation of Korea. It is only now, over a century later, that Japan and Korea have formally reconciled one of the darkest legacies of the era, the 1930s and 40s recruitment of Korean women and girls as sex slaves known as comfort women. Japan's imperialism in Korea ended in 1945, and Japan renormalized relations with South Korea in 1965. But the psychological wounds it inflicted there have never been fully healed. Japan and South Korea have, ever since, been locked in a sort of unspoken negotiation over this past, over how to remember this chapter in their shared history, a question that is still unresolved within Japan itself. In recent years, the conversation has focused overwhelmingly on the issue comfort women. During Japan's imperial wars in Asia, it forced thousands of girls and women to become sex slaves for Japanese troops. It called these girls and women, many of whom were Korean, comfort women. On Monday, Japan and South Korea have reached an official agreement that they say will close their years-long dispute over Japan's guilt and responsibility for enslaving Koreans as comfort women. The terms of the agreement are still forthcoming, but it appears that Japan will officially admit wrongdoing and offer an $8 million compensation fund for victims. In return, South Korea will promise to stop raising the issue. But this is about much more than just the comfort women issue. It's about litigating what kind of country Japan is allowed to be, both in the history books and in the world today. It's about shaping the 21st century order in Asia, and the story of why this is happening at all, and why only now, nearly a century later, goes back to some grave and long-lasting American mistakes in its wartime occupation of Japan. So the first question is, what are comfort women? You just need to define it. This is, in some ways, a Korean story. While Americans today associate South Korea with risque K-pop music videos, the country was, for a very long time, deeply, deeply socially conservative, and remains more socially conservative than may be immediately obvious to the Westerners. Korean girls and women came home to find their own families and communities blame them for their rapes. Isolated and often estranged, they were pressured into silence. It wasn't until 1991, when a Korean comfort woman survivor spoke out, that others came forward as well. They weren't just confronting Japan, but their own societies that had forced this issue into the dark. Since then, more have spoken out, and Koreans, now more socially liberal, have listened. In 1993, only 2 years later, the Japanese government formally apologized with the Kono Statement, acknowledging its guilt and the government's wrongdoing. But the 1993 apology immediately became a political controversy in Japan, with Japanese conservatives condemning it, disputing Japanese guilt, and making sure that this Korean wound stayed open. Since then, within Japanese politics, debating the Kono Statement has been a way of debating Japan's own wartime history. It is, in some ways, an argument that is more about Japan today. How guilty should we feel about our past? Should that shame dictate how we act towards our neighbors? Is it really right that once great Japan should be so submissive and apologetic? These debates aren't really about the 1940s wartime abuses, but rather about whether Japan today gets to be a proud and powerful country, or whether it has to be the kind of country that apologizes to its former colonial subjects and suffers the humiliation of America's continued military presence. But these debates have often played out within Japan's politics, on the question of comfort women and whether Japan was right to apologize. Japanese conservative leaders, many of whom are nationalists who want Japan to rebuild its military and once again become a proud Asian power, thus tend to downplay the comfort women issue. This started becoming a much bigger issue in 2012, when Japanese conservatives took back control of the government, now led by conservative Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Abe had for years argued that the comfort women claims were overblown. In 2007, during his very brief first tenure as minister, he passed a cabinet resolution claiming that there was no official proof the woman had been coerced at all. On returning to power in 2012, Abe had issued a lot more nationalistic rhetoric and has been frequently accused of whitewashing imperial-era crimes or even glorifying them. He's also rolled back restrictions on Japan's military that had been imposed as part of Japan's 1945 surrender and has tried to remake Japan as a regional power once more. So Abe's government has been hesitant to admit guilt for wartime abuses, partly because this would anger nationalist Japanese voters who are tired of being told to apologize, and partly because it would cut against Abe's desire to roll back Japanese pacifism. But this has just dragged on the issue, infuriating Japan's neighbors, isolating the country within Asia, and emboldening a Japanese far right that actively celebrates their fascist past. There's another important dimension to all of this. There is still a substantial Korean minority in Japan, and those Koreans still endure discrimination and racism every day. Today, it's very different from say Jews in Germany, who can expect not just equal treatment but robust legal protections and social norms that forbid anti-Semitism. And it contributes to a sense of among Koreans, fairly or unfairly, that Japan is unrepentant and perhaps in some ways unchanged. How comfort women became such a big issue and why it is happening now? That is your question for this section. The agreement that Japan and South Korea reached on Monday goes much further than the 1993 apology. Japan will offer $8 million in compensation to the remaining Korean survivors, who number only a few dozen, and will officially apologize. Abe will also make clear he's apologizing in his official capacity as prime minister, something that was left vague in 1993. In return, South Korea will promise not to raise the issue again, which is another way of saying that they will consider it officially resolved. Japan's 1993 apology was done unilaterally, whereas this agreement was reached by bilateral consensus between the two countries. Jennifer Lin, a Dartmouth professor who studies Northeast Asian politics, pointed out this means there is buy-in from South Korea, thus giving Koreans a voice in the agreement and a sense that they were not just apologized to, but heard themselves. Lin also emphasized that this agreement was made by conservative Japanese government, the very faction that had been so critical of Japanese liberal leaders offering apologies and so forth. That's a big deal for getting not just the Japanese government, but the Japanese people to accept the apology as legitimate. So this time, the group that would be the most likely to denounce such an agreement is the one that negotiated it, Lin told me. This bodes well that it will be accepted in Japanese society. In other words, this agreement brings together the two factions that were left unsatisfied by the 1993 agreement: Japanese conservatives who disavowed it and South Koreans who felt left out. What's in the Japan-South Korea agreement and why it's a big deal? Question mark. If you watch or read American media, you will probably come away with the impression that this is happening because the United States government pressured its two allies into making up, and that this is all about the U.S. trying to build strong Asian alliance so as to counter China. But those issues are really secondary here. This is in fact primarily about Japan and South Korea and what they want, not the U.S. or China. The big decision today was Seoul's, Linda said. This agreement reflects that Seoul is more willing to deal with Tokyo than it had been before, when it was freezing Tokyo out completely. South Korea's leaders, in other words, decided that they were ready to resolve the issue. Lin says this in part because South Korean and Japanese interests happen to be lining up more fully anyway. You need to reserve the casual arrow, Lin said, when I was asked if this agreement would improve Korea-Japan relations. It's not the agreement that causes relations to get better. It's the leaders' desire to make relationships better that caused the agreement. The US, she pointed out, has been trying to bring South Korea and Japan together since the 1950s and has never really been able to push either country toward the other. To some degree, Abby finds Abby may be feeling like he needed to do this, not to police the Americans or to counter the Chinese, not primarily at least, but rather to give himself more room to continue growing Japan's military and rolling back Japanese pacifism. The country has been officially passive since the end of World War II. Since taking office, Abe has slowly remilitarized Japan, which he seems to earnestly consider both necessary and part of this legacy. But those policies have been unpopular among Japanese voters. Perhaps Abe initially thought that stirring up nationalism, for example, by downplaying Japan's enslavement of copper women, would generate popularity for his militarism policies. But that didn't really work. And it worsened relations with South Korea and China, which just ended up making his militarization policies even more controversial. So regardless of what Abe really believes about comfort women, he may have concluded that apologizing for them would grant him more space to continue growing Japan's military, which is likely what he cares about more. Your last question is, why is Japan finally apologizing now, and what it means for Asia?